Elena always felt slightly out of place at family gatherings. Not because her family was unwelcoming, they were warm, talkative and loving, but because she had a sense for things that others ignored. Today, as she watched her sister Clara laugh at some story Damien was telling, Elena's unease began to creep in like a shadow over a bright room. Damien, her sister's husband, smiled in that way that made everyone around him feel safe and adored. He was handsome, charismatic, and articulate, everything a man should be. Everyone adored him. Everyone except her. As Clara leaned into him, her eyes sparkling with amusement, Elena noticed a flicker in Damien's expression. A brief, almost imperceptible smirk that didn't reach his eyes. A chill ran down her spine. She shook it off as paranoia. She always did when her instincts screamed too loudly. But deep down, a voice whispered, sharp and icy. He's hiding something. He's dangerous. The evening continued with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread filling the air. Elena smiled politely as Damien told another story, this one about a supposed business triumph. Everyone laughed at the right moments, clapping him on the back. Elena forced herself to laugh, though it felt hollow. Every word he spoke seemed carefully chosen, rehearsed, as if each sentence had been crafted to lull the family into trust. And yet, there was something in the undertone. Something predatory. She excused herself to the kitchen under the guise of helping with dessert. As she washed her hands, Elena replayed the day in her mind. The subtle lies Damien had told about his work. The way he avoided direct answers to questions about investments. The half-smile he gave when Clara mentioned her father's business. A memory, sharp as glass, returned, a fleeting thought that seemed almost audible in her mind, as if it had been spoken directly to her without leaving his lips. Just wait. I'll bankrupt them all. Elena's heart pounded. She blinked, trying to convince herself it had been her imagination. Yet the certainty remained. He had a plan, and it involved destroying the people she loved most. Her hands trembled slightly as she dried them on a towel. How could she tell anyone? No one would believe her. Clara would be horrified and defensive. Their parents. They adored him. And who could blame them? On the surface he was perfect. Too perfect. Her thoughts were interrupted by Damien's voice, smooth as silk. Everything all right, Elena? She forced a smile. Yes, just washing up. He nodded, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Elena felt a spark of something unsettling in his gaze, a silent challenge that made her skin prickle. She returned to the dining room, her mind racing. Every laugh, every compliment, every casual touch he shared with Clara now carried a hidden edge in her perception. As dessert was served, Elena found herself sitting slightly apart, pretending to enjoy a slice of chocolate cake. She studied Damien across the table, noting how easily he manipulated the flow of conversation, how everyone hung on his every word. It was a performance, and she was the only audience member who could see the cracks. By the end of the evening, Elena had decided on a silent resolution. She would watch him. She would learn his patterns, his intentions, and if necessary, she would outsmart him without anyone else knowing. The family could never suspect. They had to see Damien as the perfect man he pretended to be. Only she could see the danger lurking beneath the charming facade. As she left the table, helping her sister clear the dishes, Elena's mind was already racing through plans, contingencies, and small tests she could run. Damien believed he was untouchable. He didn't know she was already thinking 5 steps ahead. And somehow, she had to make sure her family survived what was coming. The night ended with smiles, hugs, and promises of future gatherings. To everyone else, it had been a normal evening. But Elena lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet house, and felt the first real twinge of fear. Damien was a wolf in her family's clothing, and she was the only one who could see the teeth beneath the fur. The morning after the family gathering, Elena returned to her usual routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every smile Damien had given the night before now seemed like a mask. Every word he had spoken seemed like a carefully rehearsed lie. She tried to convince herself she was overreacting, that paranoia was her constant companion, but a small voice inside whispered that this time, it wasn't. It began with minor oddities. The first clue appeared in the living room. A document left on her father's desk, just slightly out of place. Elena hadn't intended to look, but curiosity overpowered her. The paper bore the heading of a financial institution, listing several recent transactions in accounts she knew should have been untouched. The numbers were unusual, too precise, almost mechanical. Elena felt a tightening in her chest. Damien had access to the family finances through Clara, and these transactions, they weren't explained. Later that day, Elena noticed a pattern in Damien's behavior. He called Clara several times, always leaving the room abruptly when she entered. On the surface, these calls seemed normal, business-related chatter or brief check-ins, but there was a hidden rhythm, a secrecy that made her uneasy. One evening, as she tidied the guest room where Damien had stayed overnight for work, she found a small folder tucked under the bed. It was neatly organized, but inside were receipts, notes, and what appeared to be business proposals, all referencing the family company in ways that suggested manipulation rather than legitimate investment. Elena tried to discuss her unease with a friend, but she quickly realized how impossible it would be to get validation. "He's charming and successful," her friend said. "He's clearly devoted to your sister. Maybe you're imagining things." The words stung, but Elena knew they were wrong. She wasn't imagining things. She could feel Damien's intentions like a cold draft brushing against the edges of her consciousness. That evening, she decided to test him subtly. During dinner, she asked casually about a supposed business trip Damien had taken recently. He smiled, relaxed, and gave a detailed answer, citing meetings and clients with precision. But when she pressed slightly, mentioning a client she had independently heard of being involved in a questionable deal, he faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of unease passing across his perfect mask. Elena caught it instantly, her stomach tightening. That single hesitation confirmed her worst fears. He was hiding something, and she was beginning to understand the stakes. But it wasn't just financial manipulation that concerned her. Damien's manner toward the family revealed subtle psychological games. He praised her father for his business acumen, yet added almost imperceptible digs that made her father question minor decisions. He complimented her sister, yet undermined her subtly in conversation, planting seeds of doubt. Elena watched quietly, noting the precision with which he dismantled trust while remaining the adored husband. At night, she began documenting everything in a small, hidden notebook. Every suspicious transaction, every odd comment, every subtle manipulation Damien performed went onto its pages. Elena knew she couldn't act openly. To do so would risk being dismissed as paranoid, or worse, provoke Damien into retaliation. Instead, she resolved to be patient, to collect evidence and anticipate his moves. One particularly tense moment came when she overheard him on the phone in the study. His tone was low, controlled, almost cold. "Everything's on track. By next quarter, the accounts will be fully under control. No one will suspect a thing." Elena froze at the doorway, her pulse hammering. That voice, the one she had only glimpsed through intuition, was the voice of a predator she had glimpsed before but now heard clearly. She withdrew silently, heart pounding, understanding with a clarity that made her stomach churn. Damien's plan was already in motion. He was patient, calculating, and meticulous. And if she wanted her family to survive, she would have to be equally meticulous. As she lay in bed that night, Elena stared at the ceiling, her mind racing through scenarios, contingencies, and subtle ways to probe Damien without alerting him. One truth burned brighter than anything else. She was on her own. No one else could see him the way she did. No one else could hear the silent threat in his carefully crafted words. And she would need every ounce of cunning to outwit him. Days turned into weeks, and Elena found herself constantly on edge. Damien's presence, once merely unsettling, had become an almost physical weight pressing on the household. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, seemed designed to manipulate, to control, to test. And all the while, no one else suspected a thing. Clara laughed at his jokes, her eyes full of trust and love, completely blind to the undercurrents Elena could see clearly. It was during a quiet afternoon in the home office that Elena uncovered the first undeniable proof of Damien's intentions. She had been organizing her father's files, pretending to search for old invoices, when she noticed a folder out of place. Its tab read, "Strategic Investments, Confidential." Curious, she flipped it open and froze. Inside were plans detailing asset transfers, account manipulations, and legal loopholes, all pointing toward one conclusion. Damien intended to seize control of the family's wealth. The calculations were precise, the steps methodical. This wasn't random theft. It was a slow, deliberate takeover. Her heart pounded as she processed the information. The man everyone adored, the one who smiled so warmly at family dinners, was a predator in plain sight. The notebook she had started weeks ago suddenly felt insufficient. She needed more than intuition now. She needed proof. But how could she gather it without tipping him off? Damien was careful, meticulous, and always in control. One wrong move, and he would know she was watching. That evening, Elena tried to act normal at dinner. Damien, as always, commanded the room effortlessly. He praised her father's business acumen while subtly suggesting minor improvements, planting seeds of doubt about decisions her father had spent years refining. He complimented Clara on her taste in home decor, then casually mentioned an expensive addition that seemed unnecessary. Everyone laughed at his charm, oblivious to the way he manipulated perception. Elena, sitting silently, noted every detail, storing it for the long game. The psychological games Damien played weren't limited to finances. He had a way of inserting tension into the family's daily life. A misplaced comment here, a subtle insinuation there. He could plant fear and doubt with a single sentence. One evening, he lingered in the living room while Elena washed dishes nearby, speaking softly to her father about the risks of blind trust in business. The casual tone belied the weight of the warning, and Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. Damien was testing her, probing for weaknesses. Elena began to realize that Damien thrived on control, not just over money but over perception itself. To him, the family's trust was a currency more valuable than dollars. She could see how carefully he curated every interaction, every laugh, every compliment. He was a master illusionist, and she was the only one who could see the truth behind the smile. That night, she sat in her room, reviewing the folder she had found. The plans were detailed, including names of financial contacts, dates for asset transfers, and contingency measures in case the family became suspicious. Damien had accounted for everything. Except Elena. She smiled faintly, a mixture of fear and determination settling over her. He had underestimated her. But the realization brought its own terror. She couldn't act impulsively. One wrong move could tip the balance in his favor, leaving the family vulnerable and her sister devastated. She needed a plan, a silent strategy that could counteract Damien's meticulous plotting. And she needed to prepare for the inevitable psychological warfare. Damien wasn't just a threat. He was a predator who enjoyed the hunt. Elena leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had to protect her family without revealing the truth too soon, without alarming anyone. The house, once a place of laughter and warmth, now felt like a stage for an unseen battle. Every conversation, every gesture, could carry hidden meaning. Every smile could conceal a threat. She clenched her fists, a quiet vow forming in her mind. She would watch, she would learn, and she would act. Damien might think himself untouchable, but he hadn't counted on Elena. The family's safety depended on her, and she was ready to play the long game. Elena had learned that watching alone wasn't enough. Damien's plans were advancing with terrifying precision, and she needed to act, but carefully. She couldn't risk exposing herself or alarming her family. Every move had to be quiet, calculated, invisible. Her first step was to monitor the family finances more closely. She began reviewing statements when no one was around, comparing them to the suspicious folder she had found. It was painstaking work, tracking wire transfers, noting unusual account activity, and cross-referencing business dealings. With each small discovery, her unease grew. Damien's web was intricate, covering multiple banks and shell companies. One slip by him, one poorly executed transaction, could ruin everything. Elena also started testing him subtly, probing for inconsistencies without raising suspicion. One evening, during a casual conversation about a supposed business opportunity, she asked about a company he had mentioned in passing. Damien responded smoothly at first, recounting a story about a client and a meeting. But when Elena asked a question he hadn't anticipated, he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, enough to confirm that he was hiding more than he let on. Elena smiled faintly inside. It was the smallest victory, but in a game of shadows, every victory mattered. She also began leaving small, deliberate traces to see how he reacted. A misplaced document, a half-finished note about finances, a casually mentioned rumor about her father's company. Each was designed to provoke him into revealing his intentions. Damien never fell for the obvious traps, But she began noticing subtle signs of irritation. A brief tightening of his jaw, a flicker in his eyes, a tone slightly sharper than usual. He was aware, in some form, that he wasn't fully in control. At the same time, Elena had to maintain the illusion of normalcy. She laughed with her sister, helped her father with trivial tasks, and praised Damien's successes like everyone else. She smiled at family dinners, making sure no suspicion crossed her features. It was exhausting, pretending to admire the very man she feared. Yet every smile, every polite nod, was a mask she wore for their safety. One night, while checking her father's accounts, Elena discovered a troubling new transaction. A transfer large enough to threaten the company's liquidity if it went unchecked. She realized Damien had accelerated his plan. Panic rose briefly, but she quelled it quickly. Reacting emotionally could cost her more than she could afford. Instead, she crafted a quiet countermeasure. She rerouted a minor transfer through a controlled account, a small delay that would give her time to gather evidence without alerting Damien. It was a tiny victory, but one that made her heart race with relief. Her psychological tactics extended beyond finances. She began subtly influencing family decisions, guiding her father and sister without revealing her knowledge. A well-timed suggestion here, a pointed question there, nudged Damien's plans into less dangerous territory while keeping her own hand hidden. Every day was a delicate balance, a dance on a razor's edge. One wrong move and everything could collapse. Elena also realized the importance of documenting everything meticulously. Her hidden notebook now contained pages of transactions, observations, and psychological patterns. She had begun noting Damien's routines, the timing of his calls, and even the micro-expressions that hinted at his mood and intentions. Each entry was a thread in the web she was quietly weaving to catch him. Yet even in her calculated moves, fear lingered. Damien was smart, charming, and patient. He thrived on manipulation and control. Elena had to stay ahead, always imagining his countermoves. Some nights, she lay awake, rehearsing scenarios, planning contingencies, and wondering if her vigilance would be enough. By the end of the week, Elena felt a quiet satisfaction. She had disrupted a few of Damien's small maneuvers without his knowledge, gained subtle insights into his methods, and strengthened her resolve. The family remained blissfully unaware, laughing at Damien's jokes, praising his charm, and trusting a man who could destroy them all if left unchecked. Elena smiled to herself in the quiet of her room, a mix of fear and determination tightening her chest. He thought he was untouchable, but she had begun turning the shadows into her weapon. Damien's perfect facade would not go unchallenged. And when the time came, she would strike. Not with force, but with the quiet precision of someone who had seen the truth all along. Elena had been preparing for this moment for weeks, though she hadn't fully realized it until it arrived. It was a quiet evening. The house was nearly empty, her sister and father engrossed in a television show while Damien reviewed his work in the study. Elena had spent the day observing him, noting every gesture, every subtle cue, every pause in speech. She wasn't ready to expose him, but she could test him. She could push the boundaries, probe his reactions, and see how far his control extended. She approached the study with measured steps, knocking lightly before entering. Damien looked up from his laptop, the perfect smile in place. "Elena," he said warmly. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she said, her voice calm, carefully controlled. "I just had a few questions about some of the family accounts. I noticed a few discrepancies, and I thought you might clarify them for me." His smile faltered ever so slightly, a flicker of irritation masked instantly by charm. "Discrepancies? Oh, I'm sure it's nothing. Banks make mistakes all the time. Perhaps you misread a statement." Elena's lips curved in a subtle smile. "Perhaps," she said softly, tilting her head. "But I've double-checked. And some of the transfers don't seem to match the accounts they're linked to. It's odd, isn't it?" For a moment, Damien's expression hardened, the briefest shadow crossing his face. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Elena, I appreciate your diligence," he said smoothly. "But trust me, everything is perfectly in order. There's nothing to worry about." The challenge in his tone was unmistakable. He wasn't simply reassuring her. He was testing her. He wanted to see if she was bold enough to press further, smart enough to catch him in a lie. Elena felt a shiver of both fear and satisfaction. She had touched the nerve, and he had reacted exactly as she predicted. "I see," she said softly, leaning slightly against the doorframe. "Of course, I trust your expertise. It's just, sometimes I wonder how a man so busy can manage so many things without error. You must have remarkable skills." Her voice was neutral, almost admiring, but the words carried a subtle edge, like a probe. Damien's eyes flickered, a micro-expression she had learned to read like a book. He nodded slowly, maintaining composure. "Skills, yes. But also experience. You learn to anticipate issues before they arise." His tone carried an unspoken warning. "Don't underestimate me." Elena remained silent for a moment, studying him. She realized this confrontation wasn't about accusations. It was about testing boundaries, gauging his psychology, and understanding the depth of his manipulations. Damien thrived on control, but she could see cracks. Small, almost invisible, but there nonetheless. "I suppose," she said finally, "it's comforting to know everything is so under control." Her words were casual, but the meaning was clear. She was aware, watching, and ready. Damien's smile returned, but it was slightly strained this time. "Yes, control is essential." He tapped his fingers on the desk once, then returned to his laptop, leaving her standing in the doorway. The room was thick with unspoken tension, each aware of the silent chess game they had just begun. Elena retreated to her room, heart pounding. She had learned more in that brief encounter than she could have hoped. Damien was perceptive, ruthless, and patient, but not infallible. He had recognized her probing, but he hadn't yet discovered the full extent of her knowledge. That meant she had time, enough to continue gathering evidence, enough to prepare for the moment she would act decisively. As she lay in bed later, Elena reflected on the encounter. Fear and adrenaline intermingled, sharpening her resolve. Damien had underestimated her, and that was a mistake he could not afford. The stakes were higher than ever. One slip, one misstep, could cost her family everything. But she also realized something important. She didn't need to confront him with accusations or anger. She only needed to outthink him, to anticipate his moves, and to quietly dismantle the power he thought he held. The first confrontation had been brief, but it had changed everything. Elena felt the thrill of control she had rarely experienced before, an acknowledgement that she wasn't entirely at his mercy. The game had begun in earnest, and she was ready to play. Elena quickly realized that this battle couldn't be fought entirely alone. Damien was clever, careful, and increasingly aware that someone was watching. If she didn't find a way to gather support, or at least secure a backup, her efforts could crumble in an instant. But the problem was simple. Who could she trust? Everyone in the family adored him. Any attempt to involve them directly could backfire catastrophically. Her first thought was the household staff. The family had employed Maria, a long-time housekeeper, who had worked for them for over 20 years. Maria knew the ins and outs of the house and the family's routines better than anyone. Perhaps she could help. Elena approached her one afternoon while Damien was away on a business call. "Maria," Elena began cautiously, "have you noticed anything strange recently? Any unusual financial documents or behavior?" Maria shook her head firmly. "No, señorita. Damien is always so polite and respectful. I've never seen anything wrong." Her eyes, however, carried a subtle wariness, a hint that she sensed tension but didn't know its source. Elena realized this was as far as Maria could go. She might be helpful in small ways, but confronting Damien directly was out of the question. Elena had to consider other possibilities. Could Clara be involved, even unknowingly? She had spent years trusting Damien completely, but perhaps her sister could be persuaded, gently, to see small inconsistencies without alarming her. Elena decided against direct confrontation for now. It was too risky. Instead, she focused on subtle nudges, mentioning small financial details in conversation, raising questions about minor inconsistencies, and watching Clara's reactions. So far, her sister remained oblivious, absorbed in her admiration for Damien. The real challenge came in the form of betrayal. One evening, while reviewing her meticulously kept notes and financial documents, Elena noticed an odd pattern in a minor bank transfer. She traced it carefully, only to discover that Damien had apparently been tipped off, or someone close to the family was feeding him information about her movements. Her stomach dropped. She realized, painfully, that she couldn't trust anyone fully, not even those who seemed loyal. Someone had observed her, or worse, reported small behaviors to Damien. Fear and anger mingled, sharpening her focus. Damien was testing boundaries, watching for any sign of resistance. Every step she took was being scrutinized. And now, with a potential accomplice in play, the stakes had risen dramatically. She had to adapt quickly. Elena decided to exploit this knowledge strategically. If someone was informing Damien, she could feed them false trails, subtle misdirections that would lead him into overconfidence. She made careful entries in her notebook, sometimes planting misleading notes in places where she suspected he might notice. She was turning his own spy network, or whatever minor leak existed, against him. Despite the tension, Elena also began identifying small ways she could leverage allies without fully revealing her knowledge. Maria, for example, could quietly observe Damien's habits. What time he entered the office, how he handled certain documents, without being implicated. Even minor details could provide crucial evidence later. Every small observation became a weapon in her silent arsenal. And yet, Elena could feel the psychological strain building. The knowledge that she was surrounded by potential betrayals, the constant vigilance, and the necessity of maintaining her calm facade weighed heavily on her. Some nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though she were trapped in a spider's web, every movement observed. But there was one comforting thought. Damien might be clever, but he wasn't omniscient. Every move he made had limits, and Elena had learned to notice patterns, to read micro-expressions, and to anticipate missteps. Allies might be scarce, and betrayals likely, but she had her wits, her knowledge, and her resolve. The night ended with Elena quietly locking her notebook away. She knew Damien was a step ahead in many ways, but she had begun to manipulate the unseen currents flowing through the house. He might think he controlled everything, but Elena had begun planting seeds that would grow, quietly and invisibly, into the foundation for his undoing. Elena had spent weeks preparing for this moment, quietly studying Damien's routines, noting every predictable movement, every habitual gesture, every tiny vulnerability. If she was going to catch him in the act, it had to be flawless, calculated, subtle, and undeniable. One misstep could alert him, giving him the chance to tighten his grip on the family and destroy her careful preparations. The opportunity came sooner than she had expected. Damien had scheduled a private meeting at the Home Office to finalize one of his strategic investments. Elena had already learned he would not question being alone with certain documents. He thrived on secrecy and assumed his control was absolute. That assumption was about to be exploited. Earlier that day, Elena had discreetly duplicated key financial documents, noting the discrepancies she had previously uncovered. She created a false trail. Subtle errors, small miscalculations, and intentionally misleading notes. Then she arranged a minor accident. A pen placed in a way that would spill ink onto a folder if Damien opened it incorrectly. It was a simple trap, but psychologically, it was meant to provoke a reaction, a micro-expression of irritation or fear that would reveal cracks in his calm facade. As Damien entered the office, he greeted her with his usual charm. "Elena," he said smoothly, "I hope you're not still worried about those trivial statements we discussed earlier." "I'm just being thorough," Elena replied, voice calm, almost casual. She gestured to the folder she had left on the desk. "I thought I might double-check these figures with you. Sometimes fresh eyes catch things that slip through the cracks." Damien's smile remained, but there was a brief, imperceptible tension in his posture. Elena noted it immediately. As he leaned over the folder, reaching for the documents, the pen tipped, spilling ink across the carefully arranged papers. Damien froze, a micro-expression of shock passing across his face before he masked it with his habitual charm. He said, clearing his throat. "A minor inconvenience. Nothing to worry about." But Elena saw it, the flash of irritation, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of awareness that she had disrupted his carefully controlled environment. She let him settle, maintaining a neutral expression. "It's odd," she said softly, "how some transfers don't line up with the rest. I'm not suggesting anything, of course. Just curious." Damien's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile never faltered. "Curiosity is good," he said, voice smooth. "It keeps people vigilant." But Elena caught the faintest tremor in his tone, a crack in the perfection he projected. Elena held her gaze, quietly analyzing every movement, every blink, every shift in posture. Damien was aware she had planted the trap, yet he couldn't openly react without exposing himself. It was a silent standoff, a battle of wills fought in the unspoken. She realized then that catching him didn't require accusations. It required patience, observation, and precise manipulation. By the time the meeting ended, Elena had everything she needed. The subtle signs of irritation, the way he had hesitated, the tiny cracks in his flawless demeanor. She retreated quietly, heart pounding, notebook in hand, recording every detail. Damien had been tested, and though he didn't realize it, he had failed in small but crucial ways. That night, Elena reflected on the trap she had set. It had been simple in execution, yet profoundly revealing. Damien's control was not absolute. His careful mask could slip under pressure, and the evidence she was gathering would, in time, expose him fully. As she lay in bed, she felt the familiar mix of fear and exhilaration. The trap had worked, not to confront, not to accuse, but to observe. Every move she made now would be measured, precise, and patient. Damien was dangerous, but he was not invincible. And Elena, for the first time, truly felt she had the upper hand in a game she could not afford to lose. Elena had been meticulous. Every detail Damien had tried to conceal, every manipulation he had executed, was now carefully documented. The trap she had set in the office had revealed more than she had anticipated. Not just cracks in his facade, but subtle patterns in his planning that allowed her to predict his next moves. She knew she had enough evidence to expose him, but the question remained. How? The problem wasn't the proof. It was the timing. Clara's trust in Damien was absolute, and their parents still viewed him as flawless. Any premature revelation could shatter the family, leaving them vulnerable to his retaliation before they fully understood the truth. Elena needed the moment to be undeniable, leaving no room for denial. She reviewed her notes one last time, comparing the documents from Damien's secret accounts with the falsified transfers she had monitored and recorded. Each entry painted a consistent picture. Damien had been orchestrating financial maneuvers to gain control of the family company, redirecting funds, manipulating assets, and preparing for a hostile takeover. Every document, every bank record, every hidden communication had been catalogued. This was not conjecture, it was proof. Elena decided to act during a casual family dinner, a time when Damien's guard was slightly lowered and Clara's presence would ensure he couldn't resort to his usual charm without scrutiny. She waited until he had poured himself a glass of wine and began complimenting her sister on a minor home improvement. Smiling quietly, she set her notebook on the table, just slightly angled toward him, as if it were casually resting there. "Damien," she said softly, "I've been reviewing some documents from the past few months. It's fascinating how complex business transactions can become when there's hidden intention." His smile faltered just slightly, a subtle hesitation that only Elena noticed. "Hidden intention?" he echoed, voice smooth but tighter than usual. "Yes," she said, opening the notebook to a carefully selected page. "For example, transfers that don't match account records, or documents that suggest strategies we hadn't authorized. I'm sure it's all perfectly innocent. Unless someone had other motives." The room fell silent. Clara frowned, sensing tension she didn't understand. Damien's eyes flicked toward the notebook, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. Elena remained calm, letting the silence stretch. She had learned that people like Damien could crumble under quiet certainty, not confrontation. What are you implying, Elena?" Damien asked carefully, trying to maintain composure. "I'm implying," Elena said, voice steady, "that someone has been manipulating our finances, planning moves that could jeopardize the company, and potentially harm this family." She let the words hang in the air, her gaze unwavering. Damien's hand twitched slightly, a micro-expression she had catalogued before. He leaned forward, attempting to regain control. "These are serious accusations," he said smoothly. "Are you suggesting I—" "Yes," Elena interrupted gently. "I am suggesting that the evidence points to deliberate deception. I've documented it. Every transaction, every inconsistency, every suspicious move. It's all here." She tapped the notebook. "And unless there's an explanation, we need to take action, immediately." Clara's eyes widened in shock, her trust shattered in an instant. Their parents sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and fear. Damien's charming mask was slipping. The confidence that had defined him for years was faltering. For the first time, he was caught in a spotlight he could not control. The next few moments were tense. Damien attempted to deny, to charm, to redirect blame, But Elena had anticipated his every tactic. Calmly, she walked through the evidence, page by page, explaining discrepancies and hidden patterns. With each revelation, his defenses weakened, his control slipping further. By the time Elena finished, the room had shifted. Damien's aura of perfection was gone, replaced by the reality of his deception. Clara, stunned and hurt, turned to Elena, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why didn't anyone see this before?" she whispered. Elena shook her head, fighting back her own exhaustion. "He's careful, clever. Almost everyone trusted him blindly. But now we know. And now we can protect ourselves." Damien, silent and pale, realized the game had turned irrevocably against him. The predator had become the prey, and Elena, the quiet observer, the strategist, was finally in control. The house felt different the morning after the revelation. Silence replaced the usual chatter of breakfast. The clinking of utensils on plates seemed loud in the tense atmosphere. Elena sat at the table with her sister and parents, the weight of the previous evening still settling over them. Damien, for the first time, was absent from the room. Not because he wasn't there, but because no one invited him to sit. Clara had barely slept. Her eyes, rimmed with red from tears, darted repeatedly to the notebook Elena had placed on the counter. It had become the undeniable proof that shattered years of trust and illusions. I don't know what to think," she whispered, her voice shaking. All this time, he seemed perfect. Elena reached across the table, gently taking her sister's hand. "I know it's hard, Clara. He was careful, charming, even. But the truth is here. And we can't ignore it." Their father, usually so composed, had grown pale and silent. He held the newspaper loosely in one hand, his mind likely racing through the business implications of Damien's deception. "How could we have missed this?" he asked, voice heavy with disbelief. "I trusted him. Trusted both of you." His gaze fell on Elena, then on Clara. "But Elena, you saw it." Elena nodded quietly. "I had to. And now, we have the opportunity to stop him before he does any more damage." The first step was confrontation. Damien, previously confident and untouchable, was summoned to the living room. He entered with his usual smile, attempting charm, attempting normalcy. But it faltered almost immediately when he saw the collective resolve in the room. He realized that the family, once blinded by his charisma, now saw him clearly for the first time. Clara's voice trembled but carried an unmistakable edge. "How long were you planning this, Damien? How long were you manipulating everything?" Damien opened his mouth, but no words could fully bridge the gap between his lies and the truth exposed. The meticulously curated mask of the perfect husband had cracked. He tried to explain, tried to charm, tried to redirect blame, but Elena had anticipated every tactic. Calmly, she laid out the evidence. The accounts, the transfers, the hidden strategies, all pointing toward his intent to control the family's wealth. Her father, regaining some composure, leaned forward. "All this was intentional?" "Yes," Elena said softly but firmly. "He thought no one could see it. He underestimated our vigilance, our intelligence, and our bond as a family." Damien's posture stiffened, the last threads of control slipping from his hands. For the first time, he seemed genuinely uncertain, forced to face the consequences he had meticulously avoided for years. Clara's tears fell freely now, a mixture of grief and betrayal. He smiled at me, hugged me, acted like he loved me." Her voice broke. "And all the while, he was planning to destroy us." Elena held her sister, silently offering reassurance. "We'll survive this. Together." The family spent the rest of the day in careful conversation, working through the betrayal. Legal advisors were contacted, banks were alerted, and Damien's schemes began to unravel in real time. The house, once a theater for deception, became a sanctuary of truth, however painful it was. Though the wounds were raw, something profound began to emerge. The family, now fully awake to the betrayal, grew closer in its aftermath. Elena's vigilance had saved them from ruin. Their trust in one another strengthened, no longer naive, but tempered by experience. Damien's absence from the room, his plans now exposed, marked a turning point. The predator had been unmasked, and the family, once vulnerable, had taken back control. Elena, exhausted but resolute, realized that vigilance and courage had preserved not just their wealth, but their sense of safety and trust. That night, as the house settled into quiet, Clara whispered, "Thank you, Elena, for seeing what no one else could." Elena smiled faintly, a mix of relief and lingering wariness in her eyes. "It was always going to be me," she said softly. "And we'll be stronger for it." The weeks that followed Damien's exposure were tense, but gradually, life began to reclaim its rhythm. Damien had been removed from the family's business affairs, legal proceedings were underway, and the banks had frozen his suspicious accounts. The man who had seemed untouchable now faced consequences for his schemes, though his charm and confidence still lingered in memory like a shadow. Elena had become the quiet pillar of strength for her family. Clara leaned on her heavily, processing the betrayal and the shock that had threatened to unravel her life. Their father, once proud and confident, now approached decisions with caution, listening intently to Elena's careful advice. The family had survived, and slowly, they were beginning to trust themselves and one another again. Elena, however, remained vigilant. She knew the danger of underestimating someone like Damien, even after his schemes had been thwarted. The notebooks, the careful documentation, and the meticulous plans she had kept were now stored safely, a record of the battle they had endured and a safeguard against any potential resurgence. She understood that people like Damien thrived on secrecy and subtlety, and even now, she needed to ensure that every loose thread was accounted for. Clara had begun to rebuild her sense of agency. "It's strange," she admitted one evening, as they sat in the living room, "how someone can seem so perfect and still be so dangerous. I thought I knew him. I thought I knew everything." "You didn't," Elena said gently. "And that's not your fault. He was careful, smart, and manipulative. But now we know, and that knowledge is power. We can protect ourselves." Their father, nodding quietly, added, "Elena, you saw what no one else could. You understood him, anticipated him, and acted before it was too late. You saved this family." Elena felt a pang of both relief and exhaustion. She had carried the burden silently, made the tough decisions, and lived with the constant fear of miscalculation. The recognition was comforting, but she knew the cost of vigilance. It left a permanent mark on her psyche. Trust would never be quite the same. As the family gathered for a quiet dinner, laughter gradually returned, though tinged with caution. They spoke of mundane things, recipes, plans for the garden, small jokes that had once felt ordinary but now seemed precious. Damien's absence was palpable, yet liberating. The predator had been unmasked, and the house was finally theirs again. Even in the relief, Elena allowed herself one final reflection. Damien's schemes had been methodical, deliberate, and cruel, but he had underestimated one thing: her perception, her patience, and her resolve. She had turned his own tactics against him, observed his every move, and patiently guided the family toward safety. The experience had honed her awareness, sharpened her instincts, and proven the value of subtlety over confrontation. At night, Elena stood by the window, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. The moonlight reflected off the rooftops, casting long shadows that reminded her of the invisible battles fought and won. She breathed deeply, feeling a rare sense of calm. The family was safe, Damien had been exposed, and the web of deception had unraveled. Yet, even in that calm, a small part of her remained alert. She knew the world held more hidden threats, more wolves in disguise. But she also knew something else. She had the skill, the patience, and the courage to face them. As she returned to her room, Elena smiled faintly, a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph in her expression. The house was finally peaceful. The family, though scarred, was stronger. And Damien, the man who had once seemed unstoppable, was gone, a lesson in cunning, vigilance, and the quiet power of observation. The family's life moved forward, cautiously but steadily, a testament to resilience and careful strategy. Elena, though still watchful, allowed herself a moment of relief. The battle had been won, not with force, but with patience, insight, and the courage to see what others refused to notice. And in that quiet victory, Elena understood the truth she had carried all along. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not anger or confrontation, but careful observation, steadfast determination, and the courage to act when the time is right. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more original novel stories. And stay tuned, our next story is coming soon.